of being told what to do. So that empowerment, how do I give an individual a choice over their learning material? And if I can't do that, some aspect of their learning material. Do you want to sit in the spinny chair or this chair? Do you want to sit on the floor? Do you want me to write your name? Do you want to write your name? Stuff that seems trivial. The more choices I give to an individual, the more they feel like they're empowered. And the more that they feel like they're empowered, the more likely they have to pay attention. Or the more likely they are to pay attention. I don't know if any of you guys are here because, you know, your husband or wife made you be here, or somebody's making you be here. If that's the case, my guess is all you're doing is thinking about how long until Dan's done talking so I can get on to what else I was doing. Because you're not empowered. You're not here because you want to be here. Versus if you want to be here, you're at least like, well, I made the choice to be here. I might as well make the most out of it. That empowerment is really, really, really important. Giving individual choices. And it's probably not going to be the choice of, if you're a teacher, you're probably not going to say, hey, do you want to do this assignment? Because that's not a choice. They have to do the assignment to get the grade. But some choices you can offer within that, again, and I don't know, it's going to be situation specific, but how they go about it, whether they use a pencil or a pen, whether they use a blue pen or a black, literally any choices you can offer are going to cause that individual to be more likely to stay in a baseline state. So that's baseline and calm. Again, I know you guys didn't come here to learn about what to do when an individual's in baseline or calm, but it's probably the most important step because we leave well enough alone, but we need to stop leaving well enough alone and figure out why well enough is well enough. Any questions on baseline or any input anyone would like to add on that? I know we got a lot of educators in here. All right, moving on. Next, we'll talk about when we start to deviate from the baseline and calm. So we'll talk about triggering events. What are some triggering events that escalate your kids or yourselves or your students? What are some things that cause them to start to escalate? In the chat. Transitions, okay. What else? Not having access to an item right away. Sure. Oh, can I see some more here? Right with lots of mess. Lack of success in attempt. End of snack time. Yep. So those are all common triggering events, things that cause an individual to escalate. With me, a lot of times it's presenting a non-preferred task, asking an individual to write when they don't want to write, taking the iPad away, wanting control of an activity. Yep. All right. So what to do when an individual is in this state of arousal? All right. Number one, listen. I can't stress this enough that so often when we set an instruction, our listening goes out the window and all we're doing is inundating an individual with instructions. It's like, do your homework. And then the individual's like, I don't want to do the homework. And then it's just do your homework, and we're a broken record. Sometimes, and again, I'm not saying everything needs to turn into a debate at all. I'm not saying you need to, listen to the whole deposition on why the kid doesn't want to do homework. But sometimes you want to listen. This is so important. This statement right here, acknowledgement. I understand that you. If you can use that statement, I guarantee you'll see an increase in compliance. So often that's taken out and it's just bashing of the other person. I don't want to do homework. You need to do homework. I don't want to do homework. You need to do homework. Why is this always a fight? And then it turns into like a rant. Just, I understand that you. It's such a useful statement to use. I'm going to go back to my girlfriend with the milk example. It wasn't a huge blow up. I don't want to make it seem like that. But in that example, there's two ways that somebody can go about that. One is, well, I brought this milk. I wanted lactose milk. Well, this is what I brought. Well, that's not the milk I wanted. And now I'm defensive. Versus if she hypothetically, I don't remember what she said in that situation, but if she said or would have said, I understand that you didn't know what I meant, and this is what I mean next time. How are we going to remedy it? Now, all of a sudden, I'm not on the defensive because I'm not being accused. It was a misunderstanding in that situation. So often, and even with things that kids don't have control over, I understand that you don't like doing homework. I didn't want to do homework. Or I understand that you want the iPad back. Here's how we can get to the iPad back. Versus, no, we're all done with the iPad. Now it becomes more of a two sides are digging in versus a cooperative thing. So whatever the individual is upset about, I understand that you're upset. Again, I'm not saying you have to acquiesce and say, I understand that you want the iPad. Here's the iPad back. No, but I understand that you want the iPad. How are we going to go about getting it back? More of a two-way street. And then offering solutions, depending on the situation. Again, I'm not going to go too much into this because this is going to be super situation specific. Individual in the classroom's banging their head. Maybe you might have a room you can take them into. Maybe you don't. I don't know. It depends on the situation and the solutions that are available. But it's important to offer some solutions in that situation and to be flexible. So I might have said, all right, first 5 minutes of homework, then 5 minutes of iPad. And we might be getting nowhere because the kid's not doing homework. That doesn't mean I can't say, hey, let's play Legos or something like that. That's totally fine. I just don't want to give iPad until they do the homework. So being flexible and offering some solutions. Because, change the next slide here. The triggering event, you'll see their cognition is still pretty high. They're not super escalated here. Their cognition's pretty high. The amygdala is triggered, but if I can catch it here, I'm not going to get all of this whole escalation situation here. If I can problem solve and troubleshoot it here, boom, we're right back down to baseline, and now there's a whole lot more learning that can happen as opposed to waiting until this wave, ride this wave out. That's the triggering event. So again, acknowledgement, listening, and offering solutions. Any questions on that? Okay. Next, we have agitation and escalation. What does this look like when you guys, your kids, your students, they're starting to get, they're not full escalated, they're not max escalated, but they're getting escalated. What are you seeing or not seeing? Anybody? All right. Stomping, okay. Increased body movements, things like that. So some common things are any deviation away from baseline. So we're really good at noticing the excesses. Yep, bigger body language, voice volume. That's when voice volume comes to go up. Facial expressions tend to get more red. People tend to get more tense. That's all, an individual starting to get more escalated. Maybe if they have tics, their tics are getting a little more overt instead of subvert. What we're not as good at noticing, though, and nobody almost ever says this in any of my presentations, is the deficits. Because we're really wired to look for excesses, but we're not as good at looking at the deficits. So oftentimes, this is the parents that are like, or the teachers that are like, my kids go 0 to 100. They probably don't go 0 to 100. You just didn't notice it until they were already close to 100. So there's oftentimes deficits. Like this picture, I think, accurately describes, when my girlfriend's mad at me, she's not making excessive body movements or yelling and screaming and things like that. But what she's doing is getting quieter and moving farther away and things like that. Those are deviations from baseline. They're not excesses. She's not making more noise. She's making less noise. And if I don't notice those things, then I'm going to be in trouble. So we got to start noticing the deficits, because oftentimes we only respond to noise. As teachers, parents, we're kind of wired to respond to noise. But noise isn't necessarily the buffer that there's something wrong. Noise means there could easily be something wrong before that. Noise means that, okay, maybe something was wrong and now it's getting worse. I'll give you guys an example. We run social groups at our office for kids to work on social skills. And there's a client that I worked with that was 8, 9 at the time. And I would see him every social group, every Tuesday. He'd be in the waiting room and I'd say, hi, so-and-so. And he'd say, hi, so-and-so. And we'd have an interaction. And one day I said, hi. And he's just like, oh. He didn't yell and scream or anything. He just turned away. That wasn't an excess, but that was a deficit. So I put in my mental Rolodex, okay, he seems to be not at baseline. And that day ended up being a really rough day where we had to do some, do some behavior management. And knowing that deficit can lead you to be more aware of that. So really looking out for those deficits is going to be really, really important. Kind of the calm before the storm. A lot of times, especially kids on the spectrum, they struggle with communication. The more escalated they get, the less they can communicate. So they might actually get calm as they're trying to figure out what to say. And if there's more stimuli being presented in their environment, that's when they're going to blow up. So really looking for excesses or deficits from baseline. All right. What to do when an individual is in this state of arousal? Number one, evaluate the environment for safety. This is so important. I don't know if you guys are similar to me, but I've had coffee knocked on me and all sorts of stuff thrown at you. So it only takes 1 or 2 times to have scissors thrown at you or your hair pulled or coffee knocked on you to where you start to become really vigilant about where stuff is. And oftentimes too, it's not so much that a kid is like, here's coffee, I'm going to throw it at you. A kid's just mad and they're flailing or they're knocking stuff over. And you're the victim of that. So evaluating the environment for safety is going to be really important. Reducing your verbal demands. This is really important. This is where you want to do less. Limit problem solving. So this is where I find that teachers and parents want to start doing problem solving. The kid's yelling and screaming, and this is, what's wrong? Tell me what's wrong. What zone are you in? Why don't you want to do your homework? And then the kid can't express it already, and now there's being a ton of verbal instructions presented, and that's just going to send the kid overboard. Reducing your verbal demands and modeling things. So I'm going to take deep breaths, and maybe when the kid calms down, then I'll put an instruction or something like that. Or I'll give 2 options. Hey, when you're ready to talk, sit in the chair, or something like that. Something easily feasible, and that's it. I'm not going to inundate them with instructions. Acknowledge the individual's frustrations or feelings. Again, this is situation specific, but oftentimes if you say, hey, I see you're upset, is there something I can do to help you with that? Acknowledgement. And then modeling appropriate adaptive techniques is so important. So if I want the kid to take deep breaths, I'm going to take deep breaths. If I want the kid to count to 10, maybe I'm going to quietly count to 10. This is great for 2 things. Number 1, it models it for the kid. And number 2, it allows you to de-escalate, because whenever kids are escalating, we're inevitably going to escalate as well. And then offer safety and soothing if appropriate. Again, some kids, if you soothe them, that helps them calm down, and then we can get back to what we're trying to do. Probably wouldn't want to do that if they're crying to get attention, because that might just reinforce it. Other kids, if we try to soothe them, it's just going to cause them to escalate more, because they're like, why are you touching me? Go away. So it depends on the situation, whether you want to offer safety and soothing, a pillow, water, something like that, or you just want to back off completely. So here's the agitation and escalation. You'll see that we're a little higher up in the behavioral continuum, and the cognition is lower. The more they do, the less we want to do, the less verbals and less things like that. Otherwise, the chances of us successfully de-escalating a situation by using more verbals is going to be less than the chance of us exacerbating the situation. So that's where, again, we use acknowledgement and we use simple instructions that can be quick and contrite and move on. That's escalation and agitation. Questions or anything on that? Okay. Next, we have the climax and peak. This is a max like escalation when an individual is in most escalated. And what does that look like? Well, that's pretty similar for, different gradients of hitting, kicking, throwing items, self-injurious behavior somebody was talking about, property destruction, any of that. This is when the individual's most mad. What do you do in this state of arousal? Number 1, safety first. At this point, an individual is not really receptive to what's going on. How do I evaluate the environment for the most safety for me and those around me and the individual? Increasing the distance. This is so, so important. If you were to look objectively at individuals when they start to escalate, what you'll notice is for whatever reason, the teacher, the therapist, the parent, whatever, get closer and closer and closer as the individual gets louder and louder and more aroused. And then they wonder why they got hit. Well, increasing the distance, giving the individual space, because maybe going back to the fear and frustration part, maybe the individual's escalating because they're frustrated. But the closer you get to them, now they're frustrated and they're fearful because there's somebody in their bubble that could cause damage to them. So that's when you're really going to get a lash out. So the more escalated individuals get, if at all possible, you want to increase the distance. Again, some young kids, maybe they would benefit from soothing, so take that into consideration. Being aware of power struggles. This is really important. This goes back to the proactive strategies. We always want to be proactive. So some of the older kids I work with, they work for Xbox, and then, you know, they do chores and get 30 minutes of Xbox. Well, it's not always like at 30 minutes, the kid's like, here, mom, here's the controller. No, the kid wants to stay on with the Xbox. And what'll happen is it'll turn into, give me the controller. No, I'm not going to give you the controller. Give me the, sometimes the parents will try to grab the controller, and now the kid's grabbing it, and now we got a power struggle, and that's when a lot of escalation can occur. So you want to be aware of that and set up situations to prevent that, whether you turn off the router of the Xbox or you do something to make it so I don't have to grab this controller. I can make it so this controller is useless, or the iPad, I can set it to turn off at a certain time. So it, you know, 3 o'clock when I say the iPad's all done, the iPad's all done, and I don't have to go grab it from him and create this power struggle. Reducing your language. This is so important. We always, as the individual escalates more, we want to reduce our language. And I can discuss specific strategies at the end about like evading and stuff like that if you guys have questions on that. About, okay, individuals trying to attack me and things like that, what do I do? But I'll hold those off towards the end. That's the climax and peak. That's when the individual is at max mad. And you'll see that the cognition's really low. I've rarely heard a kid as they're hitting and kicking and screaming and throwing stuff, and the teacher's like, calm down, then be like, okay, yeah, I should calm down. That's a better idea right now. At this point, you're kind of on the wave, and you just got to ride the wave, and you got to let it start to de-escalate before their receptiveness starts to increase. Questions on that? Any questions on the climax and peak? Ready? Let's see here. Okay. All right. Then we've got de-escalation. Probably the one you. So let's chat about de-escalation, which is, you know, the title of this presentation. So that's what a lot of people are really interested in de-escalation. So my kid's hitting their head. My kid's doing something. What does it look like? So let's talk about de-escalation. So what does de-escalation look like with your kids? So they've been max mad. They're maximum upset. And now they're starting to de-escalate. It's not like they're fully calm, but what does the de-escalation look like with your kids or your students? What does that look like?
I'm sorry, were you talking to me?
To anybody.
Oh, okay.
What is when your kids are calming down, what does that look like? Man, my mouse is not working too well on this chat all of a sudden, so sorry, I can't see the chat intermittently because my computer stinks. Oh, there we go. I'm just going to go ahead and go on. As soon as my mouse decides to work again, I will read the chat. So some, oh, there we go. See some stuff you guys wrote was tone of voice lowers, body calms down, quiet time. Yep. Breathing changes. Exactly. So de-escalation, I think a lot of people have the misconception of de-escalation. So people think that kids escalated and hitting stuff, and de-escalation is when they're calm, ready to work. There's so many steps between there. Just like there were steps of escalation that I guarantee you they were there and you either saw them or you missed them. De-escalation is the same thing. Rarely is a kid like hitting his parent and then they're like, okay, I'm ready to work. There's steps. So it might be backing away from a parent or other. So an individual is maybe hitting you and then they back away from you. They're still mad, but they're backing away. Or behaviors that are directed at others are now directed at objects. So maybe an individual is trying to headbutt you and then they go try to headbutt an object, or individual is hitting you and they're going to hit an object, or they're throwing stuff at you and then they go throw it at an object instead. Physical assault may turn to verbal assault. Blaming others. So, you know, oh, that's not fair. You're so mean. You hate me. I hate you. Whatever. Blaming others. It's exactly the inverse of the agitation and escalation phase. So just like it's not an immediate, same thing with the agitation phase. So notice how these aren't desired behaviors. Nobody likes to be cussed at, or nobody likes to have property destruction. But that sure is better than you being assaulted. So it's actually a de-escalation in terms of the calmness. Following through with the initial parts of the demand. You guys might have seen this as teachers or parents. You ask your kid to do it, they have a big behavior, and then they start doing the work. They do it real crappy. You're like, write their name, and they you know they can write it better, and they're intentionally writing it real bad, but maybe they're following through with part of the demand. Or you're asking them to clean up their room, and they throw a big tantrum, and they're doing it, but they're like slamming everything as they clean it up. Or they might vocalize. So I have this too with some of my clients where they'll say they're not going to do it as they're doing it. Well, you can't make me clean up as they're cleaning up their room. That's all de-escalation stuff. So what to do when an individual is in the state of arousal? Number one, this is so important. Acknowledge an individual's reduction from the climax. Parents have such a difficult time with this, you know, teachers, therapists as well. Nobody likes to be cussed at. I get it. Nobody wants that to happen, but it sure is better than getting hit or kicked. So acknowledging that. So, and I'm not saying to say, hey, thank you for cussing at me. That's not what I'm saying. But hey, thanks for the quiet hands, or nice job sitting down. Maybe, you know, they were hitting you and kicking you, and now they're sitting down and cussing at you. Hey, thanks for sitting down. Nice quiet hands. Something like that. Acknowledge what they're doing that's better than what they were doing a minute ago. Because it's momentum. It's going to be going one of two ways. It can't be stagnant. It's either going to be going more aroused or less aroused. And even if they're here, if the next step is here, obviously it's not desired, but it's less aroused. So I'm going to acknowledge what they did so they can continue that trajectory. Modeling self-regulation strategies and praising follow-through. Again, this is where you're going to model deep breaths and things like that. An individual has to breathe. So even if they're yelling, screaming, and then they yell and scream some more, you can acknowledge and reinforce the fact that they took that breath. This is going to help them, and this is going to help you, because I can almost guarantee as a parent, you're getting escalated as they're getting escalated. Offering soothing and hydration. Some individuals work themselves up so much that they need a soft surface or they need water. Reinforce or praise any appropriate engagement. So maybe the individual is doing the work and they're doing a crappy job. Now it's probably not the time. And I'll see this happen so often that the teachers, no, you need to write it in the box. Now it's probably not the time to argue if what they're writing is in the box right now. Reinforce the fact that they're writing on the paper. And maybe when they're done with that, next time we can get in the box. Acknowledge or reinforce something that they're doing that's appropriate. Things not to do. Number one, do not review the incident that just occurred. I see this happen so often that an individual will start to de-escalate, and now this is when the parent wants to go into lecture mode and tell them how, you know you don't get away without doing homework. Why do we have to argue about this? You want to fail out of school? You know, it turns into this lecture section, and now the kid just escalates again. So this isn't when you review that. Discussing consequences. Same thing. This isn't the time to discuss consequences. See, so often this will happen where a kid will hit his sister and escalate, and the kid will calm down and they'll be like, well, did I lose my video game? The parent will be like, well, of course you lost your video game. You just hit the sister. Well, what do you think is going to happen? Kid's going to escalate because they lost their video game. Why not? I've already lost my video game. This is when you want to defer consequences. You know what? We'll talk about that later when I'm ready. Not you're ready, but when I'm ready. Maybe, you know, it doesn't mean they're not going to know what that means, but at least you're not causing the situation to get worse. As much as possible, don't express frustration towards the individual, and try not to force an apology. This is so often I see it's so pointless. The parents will go say you're sorry to your sister when the individual is escalated, and it does one of two things. Either the kid apologizes, but it's meaningless, because if you force an apology, it's meaningless, or the individual will re-escalate over having to apologize, and now you got a tantrum over having to apologize, which is a waste of time. So don't force an apology. Don't discuss consequences, things like that. Not at this time. So here's de-escalation on the graph. Now you'll notice the graph looks a little different than it did previously. Looks more like multiple waves. Because you guys might have seen this with some of your kids, that they start to calm down, and all of a sudden they ask about their video games, and you're like, oh, well, yes, you lost your video games. Well, then they escalate back up. And then they start to calm down, and then they're like, well, can I have a snack? No, you can't have a snack. You just hit your, well, now they escalate back up. And it looks like this until they might literally fall asleep. This is what we're trying to avoid during de-escalation, this re-escalation. Do some of you guys see this with your kids or students, that they'll start to calm down and then they'll re-escalate, and it'll kind of look like this as opposed to one escalation? Any of you guys see that kind of trajectory? All right. So what happens is this. This is the escalation continuum we've been looking at the whole time. This is a child's escalation. This is the child's cognition. This is the parent's escalation. Now, why do you think it is skewed over here? Well, because parents don't notice the triggering event often. They notice when the kid starts yelling and screaming. Remember, we don't respond to calm, we respond to noise. So when the parent starts yelling and screaming, that's when we start to interject. As a result, the graph is skewed over here to the right. Same with our cognition. What's really dangerous about this is this point right here. Because our graph is skewed to the right, the kid's starting to de-escalate as we're starting to escalate. This is where we're a lot more likely to take that kid de-escalating from physical to verbal assault, but we're ready, we're getting into fight mode. So when that kid says, you know, F you, or that kid starts to assault us, or that kid starts to verbally assault us, even though it's actually a de-escalation, we're going to misattribute it as an escalation because we're escalating, and now we're gonna make the situation worse, and then you're gonna get a graph much more like this because we've caused the situation to escalate a lot more. All because we didn't notice the initial triggering event, and we're escalating after the kid. What we need to do is move this green graph either equal to the kid or preferably prior to the kid escalation with proactive strategies, so we're always ahead of the situation, not reacting and not exacerbating the situation. That's one of the more important slides of this training. Any questions on de-escalation? Okay. All right. The last one is post-crisis depression and recovery. And what this is this is when an individual actually has less energy than they would at baseline. So if you exhibit energy, like working out, right? After you work out, you're tired. No one can work out forever. Kids will go through tantrums and they'll actually get tired. Some of you guys might have kids that tantrum so much, they tantrum until they sleep. So this is post-crisis depression and recovery. And what does that look like? Well, the individual might start re-engaging in the task that they were initially not engaging in. They might withdraw or cry. They might fall asleep. They might ask about the consequences. This is where they might be hyper aware of consequences. They might be overly affectionate or apologetic. After a situation, they might want to come up and hug you, and if they're nonverbal, like really dig in, and that's their like way of apologizing. Older kids might, you know, come up and vocally apologize. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Things like that. Or they might kind of go into more of a depressive state where they express feelings of depression or lack of self-control, or God, like I just can't control myself, or why do I always do this, or kind of more of a depressive state. It's all part of post-crisis depression and recovery. So what to do when an individual is in this state of arousal? Number one, listen. I really encourage everyone to do more listening and less talking, as I've talked for 2 hours. But listen, the more you can listen, the better off you're going to be. Because this is where, again, I'm not saying it's reasonable or rational, but this is where kids are going to communicate to you things that went wrong in that situation. Assist in soothing or provide affection if probable, or, you know, if appropriate. So maybe you'll give the kid a hug and say, hey, it's okay. Maybe you won't. That depends on whether it's beneficial to the kid and whether you're in a situation to do that. Allow for space. Space is so important. Again, I can think off the top of my head, parents that as soon as situation, they need to teach that kid what they did wrong and tell that kid what they did wrong. Again, giving time and giving space, which is hard now because under quarantine, space is of premium. Do not discuss blame or displeasure from the incident yet. It's not time to do that. Discuss consequences. express frustration towards the individual, or force an apology during post-crisis depression or recovery. Again, they're not at baseline. You're more likely to have an individual re-escalate from any of these situations than de-escalate further. And that's post-crisis depression and recovery. That's over here on the side. So you'll see it's actually when the individual has less energy than baseline. They're physically fatigued, physically tired. Now, the cognition here seems like it's increased. It doesn't mean that the individual is actually smarter during post-crisis depression, but they're more aware of consequences and their actions. So it's not a good time to ask the kid to do, multiplication tables or something like that, but they are going to be very aware of that specific incident. Questions on post-crisis depression or this graph it all right here? Okay. So the next question I usually get from parents when I do this or teachers is, okay, so you've just spent 20 minutes telling me that I can't talk about consequences. I can't make this a learning lesson. When can I tell my kid what they did wrong? So talk about it. When and how should I review the incident with the kid or adult, whatever? Number one, determine if the incident needs to be reviewed. With a 3-year-old, like that individual was talking about, probably not going to be that useful to sit down and have a formal review of that incident. All you need to do is figure out, what can I do differently in the situation to lead to a different result from the kid? Me sitting down and lecturing the kids, probably only going to be therapeutic for me, as I can vent and be cathartic and get that stuff out. Not going to be useful or constructive for the situation. So oftentimes, you don't need to review the situation with the kid. You just need to review it with yourself to figure out what you're going to do different. If you decide that the individual is going to benefit from the review, you wait until the individual has returned to baseline. Why do you think we want to do that? We want to do that because the most blood flows in the brain. They'll be most receptive, and the hippocampus, the memory center, is actually going to be activated. They're also less susceptible to re-escalation. Allow both parties to express what went wrong. Again, so often I see these reviews from teachers or parents just bashing. You know better to do this. You don't hit your sister. You know you need to do homework. It's just you need to messages. Both parties can express what went wrong. Because remember, it's the child or the individual that actually escalated. So their point of view is the most valuable in that situation. And then formulate an action plan to avoid certain situations in the future. It's this hindsight versus insanity. I see it all the time. It's a saying that we have at our company is rewrite the script. How do we rewrite the script? So often we're in a movie script and we just do the same thing every day and expect a different result. A parent says every day at 5 o'clock at the kitchen table, it's time to do your homework, and wonders why every single day the kid responds the same way. Well, if you do the same thing, you should expect the same result. So what am I going to do differently? How am I going to take that, the kid banging their head when we went outside in the walk? Okay, maybe there was nothing I could have done to prepare for it. Now that I know that that's an issue, what am I going to do next time? So I don't just do the same thing over and over and expect a different result. That is how and when to review the situation. Questions on when, how, anything on reviewing the situation? Okay. The last thing I'll do is just go over a couple real quick slides on communication. I think this is really important to talk about because almost every escalation is a communication breakdown. As some of you guys are talking about when you can't get your point across or somebody's not cooperating. It's a communication breakdown, and then people get escalated. So I'm going to talk about how we can control our communication because we're the only people we can control. You can't control whether your kid bangs his head or not. All you can control is what you do, and that kid's going to respond to what you do. So communication. This is an important one. When reprimanding a child, they should be the one upset, not you. So if your kid didn't do their homework, you shouldn't be like, why don't you do your homework? There's no reason for you to be escalated. There should be some contingency in place, whether it be get good grades or get your Xbox or something. If they didn't do their homework, then they don't get the Xbox. No sweat off your back. back. No reason you should be upset about it. Their choice. Like Dr. Phil says, when you choose the behavior, you choose the consequence. They choose the behavior, they choose the consequence. You're just there to administer the consequence. You shouldn't be more upset than the kid about the consequence. So there's 5 different types of communication. There's withdrawal communication, passive communication, assertive communication, aggressive communication, and assaultive communication. And remember, 93% of communication is not what you're saying. 55% is body language, 38% is your tone. So most of what you're communicating, even if you're vocalizing something, you can be communicating most of the message in a tense manner. Even if you're saying it's okay, if you're tense, you're communicating a totally different message. So ways that individuals will communicate withdrawal, things like walking away, putting their head down, yelling no, looking away. These are all ways that kids that maybe can't say, I don't want to do that homework, there's, or they'll walk away, or they'll rip the homework up. These are all ways that individuals are communicating withdrawal. Parents do it too, and sometimes it's appropriate. Maybe a kid's nagging you and you leave the room. You're communicating withdrawal. Then it gets to passive communication. This is the more like passive aggressive. I'm communicating withdrawal. I'm going to do it, but you can tell I don't want to. Like the, those of you guys that have teenagers, you guys know the sigh, the whatever. If I have to, the victimization, well, my friend doesn't have to do it, or my dad doesn't make me do it, those kind of things. Slumping posture, intentionally doing like a really bad job on something, that's passive communication. Then there's assaultive communication. Everyone knows what assaultive communication is: hitting, kicking, spitting, stuff like that. The important thing here is to understand behavior is communication. When your kid is banging his head, he is trying to communicate something. He's doing an assaultive form of communication. So the key is for us to figure out what he's trying to communicate. Then there's aggressive communication, like raised tone, things like that. This right here is probably the most important part of this last few slides, this you need to messages. So look at yourselves and think of how often you guys say you need to do something. You need to do your homework. You need to go to your bedroom. You need to do this. The fact of the matter is the kid doesn't have to do that. The kid's not going to spontaneously combust if they don't do their homework. Think about you guys. If your significant other's like, you need to take the trash out. It's almost like, wait, what? Don't tell me what I need to do. Same thing with kids. This word need creates a visceral reaction. Try to get this out of your vocabulary. No more you need to messages. The fact of the matter is it's you as the parent that wants them to do something. I statements, not you statements, I statements. If you are going to use a you need to statement, at least use the whole statement. In order to get the iPad, you need to do your homework. Okay, that's a fair statement. But saying you need to do your homework, not an accurate statement. They don't need to do their homework. So try to take this need out of your vocabulary and replace it with assertive communication. I statements. I would like you to do your homework. It's homework time. Something like that. Whatever you can do to take you out and I in. And for some kids, the informative function is going to be useful. Instead of you need to put your shoes on, your feet are probably going to hurt if you don't put your shoes on. That's a much more empowering and informative message. Or, man, your grades might stink if you don't do this homework assignment. Informative function, I statements. Direct messages, things like that. Finding this balance between passive, being overly, allowing too much control. Do you mind if you do your homework? I'll parents it and do it like that. Are you ready to do your homework? It's like, well, obviously the kid's going to say no. You don't want to do that, and you also don't want to do, you need to do your homework right now. Something in between, an I message that's empowering and informative. That's assertive communication. Any questions on the different types of communication? If you guys don't take anything else from this presentation, take I statements, replacing you statements with I statements. I guarantee you'll see more cooperative kids. All right, so that is the end of my presentation. puts us right at 3, which as scheduled. Any questions on anything that we chatted about today, guys? Okay. Well, it was a pleasure. It's definitely unique doing this through Zoom. This is the first time I've done it through Zoom, and kind of feel like a stand-up comedian looking into a blank audience. I can't see my audience, but hopefully you guys got, found this information useful and applicable. If you have any questions, specific questions, like that one parent who was asking, feel free to stay after. I'm happy to answer any specific questions. Otherwise,